I read a quote recently that I wanted to share with you all today. Of course I've got lawyers. They're like nuclear weapons. I've got them because everyone else has. But as soon as you use them, they screw everything up. No, this episode isn't about lawyers, but rather one about nuclear weapons. This week, we're kicking off what's going to be an ongoing series about nuclear weapons throughout the Cold War. We'll cover their development, how concepts of deployment and use changed throughout the period, key figures involved, public perception of nuclear weapons, as well as efforts to get rid of them. We'll also talk about some of the safety and security incidents that occurred, and just how close to the edge the world actually came to nuclear war. I'm your host David, and this is The Cold War. So, as an introduction to this series, we're going to provide you with some general context regarding nuclear weapons during the first half of the Cold War. You know, who had them, when they got them, etc., etc. Then, with that overall knowledge established, we can push into details in further episodes. To say that the introduction of nuclear science for military purposes ushered in a new era of world civilization is probably a bit of an understatement. Suddenly, select countries had the power to destroy cities and kill hundreds of thousands of people in a single blow, and as technology advanced and proliferated, the risk of total global annihilation increased. As we've talked about previously, the United States was the first nation to enter the atomic age with the Trinity test in July of 1945, quickly followed a month later by the only nuclear weapons detonations to be used in combat. When Little Boy and Fat Man were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki respectively, anywhere between 130,000 and 226,000 people were killed. Now, although America held an absolute monopoly over atomic weapons at this time, it wasn't the only country seeking to possess them. The Soviet Union was working on its own nuclear weapons program, a domestic program that happened to be taking advantage of information being supplied by spies inside the US program, such as Klaus Fuchs and Julius Rosenberg. But you know what? Let's circle back to that shortly. First, the United Kingdom was also looking to join the ranks of the nuclear club. Although they had run their own nuclear development program, Alloy Tubes, it had been subsumed into the US Manhattan Project, largely for funding reasons. When the United States passed the McMahon Act in 1946, however, a rift was created. To explain this, we actually need to go back to the 1944 Hyde Park Agreement made between Churchill and Roosevelt. In that secret agreement, the two leaders agreed that full collaboration between the United States and the British government in developing tube alloys for military and commercial purposes should continue after the defeat of Japan unless and until terminated by joint agreement. On the American side, however, this agreement was accidentally lost, and with the death of Roosevelt in 1945, it was actually forgotten about because so few people had been present when it was agreed. So when the McMahon Act was passed, giving control of nuclear weapons to the civilian United States Atomic Energy Commission, it contained a provision regarding control of information, considering all nuclear technology to be quote-unquote restricted data, and therefore could not legally be shared, even with the nation's allies. Incidentally, the Control of Information Clause had originally been titled Dissemination of Information, but was changed and the clause modified after the defection of Igor Guzenko when it was revealed that the Soviets were successfully stealing nuclear secrets. You can see more about the Guzenko affair in our video here. Anyway, all of this is to explain why Great Britain had to make its own decision to pursue an independent nuclear program, successfully completed in 1952 with Operation Hurricane, conducted in the Montebello Islands. Now, the Soviet Union, we already know, successfully completed their nuclear development program with the detonation of RDS-1 in August of 1949. Their weapons program was headed up by the notorious Lavrenti Beria, but directed at the scientific level by Igor Kurchatov. Okay, so let's talk about the impact that the possession of nuclear weapons can have on international relations. It's often widely thought that because a country has nuclear weapons, it then possesses the so-called big stick that can be used to cajole or even bully other countries, like a democratic Gandhi in a game of Sid Meier's Civilization. But the facts don't actually demonstrate that. When we look at the outcomes of several events that happened in the early Cold War period, when the United States was the sole nuclear power, the Soviet Union still went against the stated wishes of the US. Take a look at the Sovietization of Eastern Europe, the Berlin blockade, even the Chinese Civil War. A non-nuclear power stood up to the nuclear one and even came out the winner in several of these cases. Now, back to 1946, where the international political and scientific communities were speaking out about their concerns over nuclear weapons. A United Nations agency, the United Nations Atomic Energy Commission, was created in 1946 to deal with all matters nuclear and the great deal of unease over potential future use of the bomb. Even in the United States, there was a growing movement at the highest levels in favor of destroying all nuclear weapons and establishing rigorous inspection regimes for nuclear facilities. The US representative to the UNAEC, Bernard Baruch, thus put forward a plan. The creatively named Baruch Plan proposed several ideas surrounding non-proliferation, including sharing civilian use while restricting military development, but the third point was the most radical. It called for, quote, the elimination from national armaments of atomic weapons and all other major weapons adaptable to mass destruction, end quote. The Baruch Plan also proposed the removal of the Security Council veto for any voting regarding the potential punishment of a violator. So the United States, the sole nuclear power on the planet, was proposing to get rid of its own nuclear arsenal in exchange for the assurance that no other country would build nuclear weapons. It also put forward and agreed to commit to inspection regimes to ensure compliance. Now, you might be asking what happened to the Baruch Plan because, as I'm positive you all know, it didn't happen. Well, the Soviet Union didn't trust the American plan and insisted that the Americans destroy their nuclear arsenal as a precondition of any further discussion on establishing inspection or development programs. So the Baruch Plan died on the vine. With that, the major powers, as just discussed, continued developing their own nuclear programs, including atomic weapons. Of course, the development of early fission weapons gave way to the race to build fusion weapons, hydrogen bombs, more sophisticated and capable of much larger explosive yields. The US achieved the world's first thermonuclear detonation on November 1, 1952, with the success of the ID-Mike test, a 10.1 megaton explosion on the island of Eniwetok in the Marshall Islands. This, however, was not really a bomb, since it wasn't considered deliverable, as the equipment necessary for the test was the size of a small warehouse. It took the Soviets almost a year, until August of 1953, to detonate RDS-6, the first deliverable hydrogen bomb with a 400 kiloton yield. It should be noted, however, that it took the Soviet Union until 1955 to successfully detonate RDS-37, a true multi-stage thermonuclear hydrogen bomb in a deliverable format. Now, elsewhere in the world? Well, two other nations also pursued nuclear programs, although slightly later in our timeline. France joined the nuclear club in 1960, testing its first weapon in Algeria, while the People's Republic of China, cut off from earlier assistance it was receiving from the Soviet Union, detonated its first atomic weapon at Lop Nur in Xinjiang province in 1964. So by the mid-1960s, the major powers are all nuclear armed with various levels of stockpiled weapons. But obviously none of those weapons were used against each other. Well, what stopped them? It's likely that the sheer destructive capability inherent in the weapons themselves that stopped their use. Strategist Bernard Brodie stated, "Thus far, the chief purpose of our military establishment has been to win wars. From now on, its chief purpose must be to avert them. It can have almost no other useful purpose." So, to explain, a nuclear conflict would likely mean that neither side in the exchange of nuclear weapons would survive. By definition, that precludes their use. This has become known as the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. Nuclear weapons were thus being made and designed not as offensive weapons, but as a deterrence from the other side using their nuclear weapons. This doctrine had two main consequences. The first was that provided opponents' arsenals remained relatively balanced, nuclear-armed countries wouldn't fight each other. The second consequence, however, developed in an effort to get around the first, a nuclear arms race. The Soviet Union and the United States began to develop new weapons to try and one-up the other and gain an advantage. This included such things as supersonic bombers, cruise missiles, and intercontinental ballistic missiles, all designed to deliver nuclear warheads to their targets. New strategies and tactics were employed, such as Strategic Air Command's alert system, placing 1/3 of all bombers on minutes' notice to get airborne in the event of a Soviet first strike. This was later escalated to an airborne alert, where part of the Strategic Air Command's B-52 force was always in the air, invulnerable to a Soviet first strike, but also ready to carry out its own immediate attack. Nuclear weapons drastically changed global geopolitics. Now that we have a good grasp on the overall timeframes involved in nuclear weapons development programs, as well as their strategic doctrine behind their deployment, we're going to move forward with this series by discussing some of the finer details, including the US Single Integrated Operational Plan, Strategic Air Command, and its influential commander, General Curtis LeMay, as well as some of the technology involved in all of this. And oh yeah, that quote at the start of the episode about lawyers and nuclear weapons? It was Danny DeVito who said that. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode, and to make sure you don't miss all of our future episodes, please make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have detonated the bell button. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com, and we're also active on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. If you enjoy our work, your financial support through Patreon at www.patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership is always greatly appreciated. This is The Cold War Channel, and don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it becomes heated.